The war years had all but brought the swing era to an end, and many of the greats that existed in the history of the jazz books were jobless, penniless, looking for direction and a new home. It was one man's vision that brought these men and women all back together under one roof to find a new home, a new way to make a living. Norman Granz and the Jazz at the Philharmonic, Clef, Norgran, and what eventually became Verve Records. Out of the ashes of Clef and Norgran, the Verve label brought to America hundreds upon hundreds of recordings by the greatest jazzmen and women of the great jazz era. He preserved and documented endless scores of life stories, found purpose and meaning, and gave work to and a home to so many jazz greats. On that shelf right there, going back, you'll see well over 500 of the Verve titles that built one of the great jazz canons of all time. And so many of these titles are part of the jazz canon, it's going to be hard to limit it down to tell you where to start. So for starters, we're going to split it in two. If you look here, you'll see how there's kind of color right there. Thick spines, gatefolds. And before, it's very white, simple spines, no gatefolds. And that line right there, the 8400 mark, is where we're going to split our documentary into two. Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Today we're going to talk about the great Norman Granz and the Verve label, and how do you start collecting Verve? Where do you start? It's an immense body of work. It documents so much of the great artists of jazz history. It's actually a fantastic baseline to give you what the jazz blood pressure should sound like and feel like and look like, and you can season to taste from this place. It is definitely a label with two chapters, and this is chapter 1, focusing on the Norman Granz 50s era into the early 60s. Then we'll talk about the later era with Creed Taylor in the second part. Just to give you some scope here, I want to flip through some titles real quick, and I pulled some records out that I'm going to show you in a little more in depth, but I want to real quick skip through some stuff here for you to see. Names like Parker, who has the first 10 releases in the 8000 series. Most of that's culled from earlier recordings. Basie's a really preeminent part. Art Tatum, Benny Carter, Louis Bellson, Woody Herman, more Bellson, Dizzy Gillespie, Basie, Ray Brown, Phil Nimmons is a fantastic Canadian player, Billie Holiday, Stan Getz, the Norman Granz Philharmonic, Illinois Jacquet, Gene Krupa, Oscar Peterson, Flip Phillips, Roy Eldridge, Billie Holiday again, Basie, the great Lionel Hampton, Sweets Edison and Lester Young, Johnny Hodges, Tal Farlow, Charlie Ventura, more great Johnny Hodges stuff right there, Bud Powell, more Dizzy, Stan Getz, Buddy Rich. It's a pretty impressive canon of all the greats of this era. And it is important to remember that in the early 50s, that's kind of an anomaly right there, that Yusef Lateef record. In the early 50s, after the war, jazz was quite a bit in disarray. The old swing bands were no more. Work was hard to come by. Bebop was changing the landscape. The audience was leaving for rock and roll and soul and rhythm and blues. And a lot of these guys didn't have a home, didn't have a place they could lay their head. Teddy Wilson, oh my goodness, just so many great legends here. Harry Edison, Krupa, more Bud Powell, Holiday, some Sonny Stitt. We're gonna dig into this stuff here a little deeper in a second. Junior Mance makes his first record at Verve, of all things. And you start to see a slight change here. Herbie Mann, Jimmy Joffrey steps in here. Great. Hodges doing Ellington. Harry Edison, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, Oscar, Dizzy, Jimmy Joffrey, Buddy DeFranco. You start to see a slight change here with some of the artists that are starting to show up. But for the most part, it's still very much rooted in the classics. You do if you're Norman Granz. And you know that so many of these greats that you respect and hold in such high esteem are basically without a career at this point. Basie had pared his group down to a group of 7. Ellington was having a hard time staying on the road. From what I understand, he was sometimes doing high school gigs and college, high school dances. Like, times had gotten tough. Recording studios weren't the same. What was being recorded now was rock and roll, R&B. Jazz had been marginalized. And Norman knew there was this incredible body of musicians that needed a life. They couldn't all die penniless. Norman wasn't going to let that happen. And he starts the Jazz the Philharmonic, which was literally a touring band and an orchestra composed of many of the greatest of all time. And these guys were veterans of the road, veterans of these songs, veterans of playing with each other, playing before crowds. It was a pretty outstanding ensemble, and the membership changed some, you know, as people came and went and people passed away, because a lot of these guys were further on in the years and had many miles on their odometers. This was, you know, the end of an era in some ways, and the writing was on the wall. Not only had jazz changed, but music was changing fast. And into that fray steps Norman Granz. And he launches Clef and Norgran, which you saw some of those 10 inches early on, and I have quite a few of the LPs as well. And then early in the 8000, 8100 series in Verve, they're reissuing a lot of the Clef and Norgran stuff under the Verve imprint, which had a much bigger distribution. Early on, he actually licensed some of his Clef titles to Mercury out of Chicago to borrow and lean on their distribution to get these titles out there. Because he knew these people were important. These records he's making were important documentations. And I think somehow he managed to maintain the ownership of that stuff. He seems to have re-released almost, well, a lot of it anyway, under the Verve imprint. Of the first 200 titles in the Verve canon, I would say 80% of that stuff is Norgran and Clef stuff, Jazz the Philharmonic stuff. And you're just talking about a who's who of jazz royalty. I didn't show you even the Ella Fitzgerald stuff. She has her own sequence at Verve, the 4000 series. It's about 50 titles of just Ella Fitzgerald, with a few other singers sprinkled in for seasoning. Ella was that big a deal. And my friend Jean-Michel Reiser-Beethoven has told me that Ella Fitzgerald not having a contract was part of what was the win in Norman Granz's sales. He's like, oh, Ella doesn't have a home label to call her own. And if there's any of these black artists that I know I can sell to white America, it's Ella Fitzgerald. And he wasn't wrong. Ella was magnanimous. She was just had this incredible personality. She was boisterous. She was boss. She wasn't to be messed with. She wasn't an effeminate, weak woman. She was a strong, empowered woman. She wore her color and her sexuality proudly. And yet, she was disarming at the same time. And that's a very difficult duality to pull off. because it would come off as abrasive from a lot of people. And a lot of people with less power, pull, and say were more abrasive than Ella Fitzgerald manages to be. She had a lot of power. And yet, she seems to carry it all with a certain amount of grace and sophistication and understanding of her people's racial situation and the dynamics that she was trying to help unfold and change and break. And so Ella is such an important part of this entire story. It's truly the success and demand for Ella Fitzgerald that allows Norman to record the rest of the great body of work that is Verve, Clef, and Norgran. And it's a very confusing, convoluted thing, because there's not really a rhyme or reason to what Clef and Norgran he's going to reissue on Verve. There's not a lot of clarity. I think some of it's called Clef series or something that kind of hints that it's from that earlier. But you can end up buying the same stuff easily on Clef and on Verve, on Norgran and on Verve. It's muddy waters. But the thing is, if you're out there collecting, especially if you're a jazz beginner, who this series is kind of meant for, if you see old Clef, if you see old Norgran, if you see old Verve, especially the trumpeter label, buy it. A lot of those Verve records were sold fairly well compared to Blue Note, Prestige, and Riverside, and Savoy. These records got better distribution by magnitudes of probably 5 times better. They're just so much more available, so much more out there. It keeps their costs down. And it means you can find a lot of these great records in the wild for 10, 20 bucks. Online, they've started to become more expensive, but it's rare where you'll have to spend 80, 100 bucks on a Verve record. It's rare. You can do it, but again, a lot of it's out there, and you can find them in yard sales and just the weirdest little curio shops and vintage places. They'll have a couple old Verve records, and you should grab them. Ella Fitzgerald single-handedly kind of resurfaces modern jazz and brings it to America. And when I'm saying to America, I'm talking to mainstream, Main Street, white bread, station wagon. We live in a small town, we ain't got no color. But you can go into your local Kmart or Woolworths and Ella will bring you some color. This is Ella Berlin, Mac the Knife. And you better believe that this record sold really well. The Bobby Darin, Mac the Knife song, which everyone knows, Ella had a huge success with that. Ben Webster's playing, by the way. And here's another interesting thing that I've come to kind of realize, is that a lot of these labels have a sequence that's designated kind of pure jazz, jazz for jazz heads. But then you usually have a sequence too that's designated more for commercial, more pop-oriented, lighter, easier access. And I'm convinced why a lot of these labels have the 2-number or 3-number sequences sometimes. It's to simplify things for distribution. We don't want to accidentally send too much of that Negro music to Montana, Idaho, and the Dakotas. We don't need Wyoming and Texas ending up with a whole bunch of really black, blues-driven, sorrow-filled expression of overcoming and joy. We'll send them the more accessible stuff on the 4000 series, and we won't mess with that 8000 series for Texas. And so I think for a lot of these labels, including Atlantic, there was just a sequence of records that they knew that for certain stores, for certain distribution, for certain locales, we're only going to send 4000 titles there. For Atlantic, we're only going to send 8000 series titles there. We're not going to send them the 1200 series stuff. That's meant for more blacker markets. Even after the race record terminology kind of goes away and we're kind of trying to assimilate and become less of that, they're still smart enough to know that I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to tell this store here, you only want to buy this from the 4000 series or 5000 series. Don't mess with the 8000 series. That's for Kansas City, not for you folks here in Wichita. But Ella makes record after record on the 4000 series with Duke and with Count Basie. She's bringing these two guys back to the forefront, even though they were always a mainstay and a staple of kind of the jazz culture. Ella's bringing them to a bigger table, to white America. She makes a series of songbook records that are really seminal recordings. And when I say that Verve is a great bass line, one of the greatest beginning places of all is the Ella Fitzgerald songbooks. The instrumentation is done by a lot of the greatest of all time. Her renditions of the American songbook are outstanding, to be quantified versions of those songs. And it'll help you understand jazz when you know those melodies and those tunes. When you hear a guy like Miles Davis play them without the words, you'll suddenly know the context. These two records with Louis Armstrong, super important. Louis is an institution, and Ella and Louis together brought a pop jazz sound that was digestible and safe and not too Negro. And this is America in the 1950s. It's not all mom apple pie and convertibles. There was some milkshakes happening, but there was still a lot of bottles and rocks being thrown. Cole Porter, she does a whole series of them. Irving Berlin, she does a huge series on the Gershwin songbook. Rodgers and Hart. This is her doing the Ellington songbook. Those are such important recordings, and they're a great place for you to get to know the bass line. And then we can start to step deeper into the other sounds of what jazz is and what jazz is about. And I made this comment in one of my Facebook groups the other day, listening to a Wayne Shorter record. I'd spent a week and a half just immersed in a lot of kind of Decca, RCA, Capitol, light jazz. It's great jazz, but it's still kind of light. It's still kind of middle of the road. Anything on those labels is meant to be somewhat commercial and accessible. Even some of the white West Coast cool, those records are accessible. They never get too intense. There's not too much of an edge to them. And if you don't know the fabric of the basic outline of the countryside and what it feels like to be in those safer neighborhoods, the risky shoreline, dangerous scape of a Wayne Shorter record doesn't have the same value or power. Having been immersed in kind of the pop commercial side of jazz for 2 weeks, that Shorter record felt stark and dangerous, and the rocks were craggy. The sky was gray and there was thunder, and it just had this whole ominous feel to it that was only magnified by the fact I've been hanging out on Main Street for 2 weeks, chilling, drinking cappuccinos. I had a wonderful little baguette, cream cheese, a hint of chive. Magnifique. Magnifique. It's fantastic. But I decided to take a drive out in the countryside, and I strolled past Wayne Shorter Meadow. And it was the Etc., the Tone Poet reissue. And you listen to that first track and tell me you don't see a craggy cliff shoreline with ominous birds circling, waves crashing. It's a dark place. It's dangerous. One could get hurled onto the rocks and not survive. And it needs that context of the normal for what's outlying to be an outlier. If you only listen to the avant-garde and to the edge of modern jazz and never comprehend the body of the work, if you only have a few sets of fingers and you don't have the body, you don't really appreciate the value of the fingers. You need the body to give the fingers context, to give them purpose and a meaning. And this stuff is the body. It's the organs of jazz. It's the essence of what the music's about. And let's not make any mistake about it. Jazz is about survival. It's about the experience of Black Americans. And the joy of having the opportunity to make this music, to get paid to do it, and to not get my head beat in today. Yay! Fantastic! I'll play my ass off. And we need to always recognize the power of that statement, the power of the necessity of me to play the blues so I can escape the blues. So Verve occupies a very important place in the canon. And they certainly changed course dramatically in the 60s, and we'll discuss that in part 2. But for part one, where do you start? Where do you collect from? And it's an ominous task in some ways, but it's made simpler by the fact you can't really go wrong. Anything you find, anything you buy, there won't be any buyer's remorse. And again, you're not going to have to pay $400 for some rare, obscure thing that only 17 people bought in the first place because it was only meant for 1 in 500 customers to come in the restaurant and order. You can put some weird shit on the menu. Don't expect everybody to love it. You need the regular shit so everybody can eat. And you're going to get those few eccentrics that want that weird meal, but no one wants to live on that. Even the eccentrics need to find some balance. You drink nothing but very hoppy beer all the time, you will lose the context and even not be able to describe the hops anymore because it's all you know. There needs to be balance. There needs to be more to what we listen to than just one part of the jazz canon. And so much of what the vinyl community today talks about, what the collectors scramble for, it's all this 1960s edge. It's all this stuff that's dissonant and exploratory, and a lot of it's fantastic. But that's not all that jazz is or ever was. It's a small part, and you will appreciate it more. Put it this way, it's like a film. A film that has you in safe, happy places a lot of the time only escalates the risk when danger is around. When I keep you on the edge of danger the entire time, you kind of adjust to that mentality and you no longer have the same apprehension. But when there's a plenty of safety to be had and shelter to be found, it's those moments where the rocks are right there and my dinghy might pop on them, where I can be a little bit more concerned and understand the meaning of these rocks. So let's dive in. I'm going to do this as quick as I can here. We're probably already 15, 18 minutes in here. Norgran, this is an impressive title by great Benny Carter. And Benny Carter was a swing giant, always a great composer, great arranger, a virtuoso on the trumpet and on the alto saxophone, which is a rare duality. You often get trumpet players who play other brass or saxophones who play other woodwinds, but you don't really get the sax trumpet crossover very often. Very, very cool record. This is the great Johnny Hodges session. I talked about this not that long ago. Ellingtonia 56. And just all greats on this. Paul Gonsalves, Jimmy Hamilton, Ray Nance, Cat Anderson, Russell Prokop, Quentin Jackson. Just Ellington's giants, you know. This was a Clef release that they licensed to Mercury, but it's even got the trumpeter on it. And this is early Bud Powell. And this came out originally probably as 78s even. Definitely had a 10-inch version, and this is the 12-inch version. Interesting album cover artwork. I think it's David Stone Martin. I'm not positive. If it is, it's an abstract DSM drawing for sure. Illinois Jacquet, one of the most important sax players of the era. Norman Granz was happy to give guys like that a home. The great Hank Jones, one of the great piano players of the jazz era. Elegant, dynamic, incredibly sensitive to the song and sensitive to the bandmates he's playing with. Few people know better how to exactly marry a song to the group, the ensemble that's playing it, than it's something led by Hank Jones. He just gets it. And whether he's on Cannonball's Miles Davis Something Else or playing with the great rhythm section on a pop thing, Hank Jones just knows what needs to be done. His ear is impeccable, his timing, his place, his sense of placement. He's a very unique, gifted, talented, Hall of Fame jazz guy. And this is a pretty rare record, Urbanity. That's on Clef number 707. Oscar Peterson gets a bad rap today. He made a lot of poppy kind of jazz, crossover records for Verve. Even into the 60s when they changed, they kept Oscar making those records. And he's one of the greatest piano players of all time. He's a fellow Canadian. He doesn't get as much credit as he should. In part, again, he suffers from the fact that his records sold so well that a lot of them are out there for $5-10, so no one thinks they're worth a damn. But when you listen to his early trio stuff with guitar players like Herb Ellis or Jimmy Rainey, or Tal Farlow, and you listen to, of course, Ray Brown, the great bass player, is on a lot of Oscar Peterson's work. These are all-star players, and those trio recordings, and Oscar and Ray and Herb Ellis back up many of the greatest Verve recordings that are out there. Those three are the backing group. This is Roy Eldridge, Little Jazz on clef, number 683. And Roy Eldridge is one of the fieriest trumpet players, and is a bridge from Armstrong to Dizzy, and a super important aspect of the development of the virtuosity of jazz. And of course, the great Basie, who has so many records between clef and Verve. It's a pretty endless stream. So now diving into the body of work that exists at Verve. And again, we're just talking the first half decade. 1955 to 1960, in that era, 61. I pulled about 25 titles here maybe. We're going to run through them real quick. Charlie Parker. Again, the first 10 releases of the 8000 series are Parker titles, all recorded earlier, but being reissued here on the Verve imprint with that new distribution. Basie, this is Basie in London, I believe, Paris, April in Paris, fantastic. Ben Webster, again, who we're listening to right here. All of Ben Webster's work at Verve is absolutely outstanding. Can't recommend these titles enough. Webster is the heir apparent after Coleman Hawkins to that smooth, creamy, really reedy sound of the tenor saxophone. And he can make that sucker weep. He can make that sucker laugh. No one tells a story with a saxophone. Even Coleman Hawkins doesn't tell a story quite the way Ben Webster can. The great Tal Farlow, Octopus, they call him because of those giant hands of his. One of the great guitar players of the jazz era. Again, more Illinois Jacquette. Some early Oscar Peterson trio stuff here at the Stratford Theater. And you can see Ray, Herb Ellis, and of course Oscar himself. Oscar seems to be a guy that had a fairly big ego. You know, he took himself fairly serious, it seems like, and probably rubbed some people the wrong way at times. But he also grew up in Canada where there was race issues, but they weren't the same as they were in America. And I think that impacts his personality somewhat. Johnny Hodges, the great alto sax player who plays with Ellington's orchestra for years, makes probably 20 records at Verve. Some with Ellington guys, some in smaller ensembles, some with Wild Bill Davis later on, the organ player. Anything Johnny Hodges, that creamy tone, you're going to be in good hands. Sounds like Roy Eldridge right there. Maybe that's Dizzy Gillespie. I guess that was Roy Eldridge. I'm not sure. Stan Getz. And we all know Stan Getz from those 60s Verve titles, especially the Bossa Nova titles. But Stan Getz comes from bebop. He was a fiery player, and he always had that fairly smooth tone, velvety and smooth. But he was actually a fairly fiery player, especially on his Roost titles. But all of his mid to late 50s Verve titles are outstanding work. West Coast sound, more West Coast sound. This self-titled one, his work with Dizzy Gillespie, just incredible. The great Lionel Hampton. This, of course, Flying Home is a reference to his great song, Flying, and the great soloists that would play on that. Lionel Hampton, in my research over the last year and a half, I've come to realize is one of the great band leaders. He leads a lot of great men. I would venture to say 60% of the great young black jazz musicians who came up in the 30s and the 40s, into the 50s, spent some time with Lionel Hampton's orchestras. It was a real proving ground, a real training place, and he seems to be the personality that would let you come into his orchestra and hone your skill set and your sound. Lionel encouraged that, it seems like, because a lot of disparate sounds came out of that orchestra. It's really a who's who of the black jazz player who played with Lionel over those decades. Harry Sweets Edison, one of the sweetest toned trumpet players you'll ever hear. Miles is cloudy and fuzzy. Sweets is refined, pure, clean, clear. It drips like honey, syrup onto your tongue, into your ear palate, and cleanses your soul. It doesn't have the resentment that Miles has in his tone, the acerbic bitterness, the unsatisfaction that Miles voices a lot. Sweets is sweet, sugary, but he's not in any way corny or canned. Sweets ends up playing a lot of the great Frank Sinatra records, Capitol records. He's a backing trumpet soloist on a lot of great vocal jazz records. You gotta love Sweets Edison. He's a very important part of the canon. Billie Holiday, as much as Norman loved Ella Fitzgerald, he also recognized the importance of Billie Holiday. And she's rather, what's the word I'm looking for, the doppelganger of Ella in a lot of ways. Ella was big, boisterous, filled with endless energy. She could sing each line of the verse with different harmonic and melodic inflections, rhythmic pulse. She was super creative. Ella would present a song differently every time she did it, depending on her mood and the time of day. Ella was incredibly creative, an endless wellspring of ideas. Ella's range was limitless. She had incredible blues to her, incredible pop sensibility. Her ability to interpret the lyric the way the songwriter probably most likely wanted it to be. Ella dove into that and found that center. Billie Holiday was minimalist. She would sing a very small range with languid, sorrow-filled, behind the beat, strung out interpretations of the lyrics that would often shift the meaning of the song and make it something very personal to her life's experience. Ella interpreted the lyric. Billie interpreted Billie. She relayed Billie to you through those songs, and they became hers after she did them because her version has such a personal feeling to it. She's a very unique persona, troubled by drugs, troubled by alcohol, troubled by sexual predation, molestation, rape, bar fights, you name it. She could muck it up with you. You know, she could drink you under the table. She got old and frail in the 50s, way before her years, and dies way too young. I think we lost her in 56, if I remember, memory serves. And it's a sad day when we lost Billie Holiday, but she's such a wonderful counter to the bright, light, springy sound of Ella. You have that cold, damp, clammy, disparate, frail Billie interpretation of all the same songs at times. It's a pretty special relationship. Gene Krupa, Buddy Rich, Louis Bellson, three of the great drummers of the swing era, all make many recordings at Verve in this time frame. Lester Young, again, this is going to be something recorded earlier on because he's passed, I think he passes in 53, 54. These guys are all starting to drop at this time, you know. Lester, of course, one of the greatest tenor players of all time. He played with that tenor off to the side with the mouthpiece kind of turned. Just a creamy storyteller. He's sit on my knee, grandson. Let me tell you a story. That's Lester Young, you know. And again, a guy who had health issues and drank a lot. And drinking was a fairly common thing for a lot of these guys. And these guys, some of these guys are pre-heroin, but some of them, like Billie Holiday, obviously dabbled in heroin plenty. Bud Powell, one of the saddest stories in jazz. Bud Powell was the heir apparent in some ways. He's got the technical vivacity of an Art Tatum. He's also got the minimalism and construct of a Thelonious Monk. Powell could do both. His dexterity was unrivaled. but through a series of beatings by the police, arrests, institutionalized, shock therapy, escaping mental places, being recaught, the demons and the inflection of poor medical practices, and obviously I think some stuff was even being experimented on, as always is the case in medicine. But I think blacks got the brunt of that a lot of times. You know, we can test things on these Negroes and no one's going to be able to do nothing about it. He became a shell of himself. He lost some of the Tatum abilities to be super dynamic and expressive. But Powell always retains an interesting and soulful and edgy sound to what he does. He makes a lot of great recordings for Verve, kind of in between his Blue Note stuff. He's at Blue Note, he comes back to Verve, goes back to Blue Note for a little while, and then he ends up in Europe, I think, for a couple of years, and then he passes away, probably 57. So we're losing guys here. This is President and Teddy Wilson, which is Lester Young, of course, and Teddy Wilson of Benny Goodman fame. Benny Goodman brought him and Lionel Hampton to the fore when he first integrated his band with these two young black geniuses. And as great as the orchestra that Benny Goodman had was, he recognized that Teddy Wilson was special. He recognized that Lionel Hampton was special. And I'm going to put these guys out there so we can swing even harder. I'm already the king of swing. Watch me elevate that crown. And Goodman was a tyrant from most people's experience with them, but he also would fight for what he believed. And he fought for those black musicians and was a great ambassador, like a Norman Granz, for change, and wouldn't take no for an answer. You're not going to let my black musicians stay here? Well, the Benny Goodman Orchestra won't be playing here tonight. And I know you sold 500 tickets, and I know you want to make some of that money, but I will march right back on that bus if I even get a hint of you not treating my black musicians properly. And they forced America's hand. They forced integration. And it's so important to remember that as Jackie Robinson in baseball was integrating baseball, music had already been laying those tracks for a decade and a half. Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy probably would have benefited from having been elsewhere from Verve in some ways. I think he gets lumped in with these swing cats, and he's definitely a much more modern player. Manteca, where he's tackling the Cuban Latin fire, it's fantastic stuff. And I think a lot of modern collectors, it's just Dizzy being... He's a brilliant genius. Dizzy's an absolutely complex cat. He understood the math, he understood swing, he understood dynamics. He plays a ballad as good as anybody, surprisingly. You wouldn't think that Dizzy's going to kill you on a ballad. He can kill you on a ballad. Dizzy's a fantastic player, and his place in the jazz kingdom should be elevated. And the critics know, and most of the jazz writers will say, oh yeah, Dizzy, one of the great. But in terms of actually people buying his records and them being collectible, people caring about them, and I think he would have benefited actually by being around more of the young modern kids. But his body of work at Verve is still outstanding stuff. And Dizzy, like Lionel Hampton, like Woody Herman, often houses many of the great young up-and-coming black talent in his groups. Because Dizzy had a big band for a while in the late 50s, and he was putting together these bigger orchestra pieces that was doing bebop, elements of hard bop, elements of swing, elements of the blues, and he was trying to construct it all together so that he could say that what happened in the past and what happened today are congruous. I could interlay these pieces together just fine. And while Parker was off doing his drugs and selling his horn and wearing some ratty-tatty suit, Dizzy was looking good. He had his spectacles, his little soul patch, he had his beret, he had his puffed out cheeks, and he was an ambassador for jazz. He really was. And being at Verve, it gave him employment, probably a decent paycheck, and exposure. It's probably some of why Dizzy's bigger in Europe than he is in America. You know, Dizzy deserves more recognition, and I think he would have benefited, honestly, by having made a couple records at Blue Note or Prestige or Riverside, just to have those collectors in that era value him more. Woody Herman makes a number of great records at Verve, and he's one of the great leaders of the white swing cats of the 50s, and along with Stan Kenton, so many of the great young white talented swing cats, jazz cats, modern cats came through Herman and of course Stan Kenton's orchestra. And Stan Kenton's going to be over at Capitol. Sonny Stitt. Sonny Stitt makes a series of recordings at Roost from about 53, where he makes that hi-hat 10-inch, all the way through about 56 or 7. Sonny Stitt is an absolute institution at Roost Records and a huge part of the success of the Roost label. Along with Johnny Smith, the label is really driven by those two artists in the 50s, and Roost doesn't survive the 50s. It eventually sells out to Roulette. But his recordings at Roost are outstanding. There's probably about a dozen of them. But he comes to Verve in 57, I would guess. And between 57 and 59, he manages to make 12, 14 records at Verve that are outstanding. Just outstanding. Blows the Blues is one of the best of the bunch. But you can't go wrong with anything that Sonny Stitt does at Verve. Coleman Hawkins, again, one of the giants here with Ben Webster. So if you find this at a record store, you got Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins. These are the two guys that wrote the blueprint for what the tenor saxophone canon should be. How would you not buy that? Why would you not buy that? If you wanted to understand the innovations of a John Coltrane, or what makes Ornette Coleman different, or what makes Sonny Rollins loud and expressive, you need to know Webster and Coleman Hawkins to get it. You can't understand the innovations of a great TV show if you don't know what the body of TV is like beforehand. Again, Ellington doesn't record for Verve, in part because he's under contract at Capitol and Columbia, who probably could pay better than Verve could. And Ellington still had a fairly decent following, and he puts out a huge body of work in the 50s, but most of Ellington's men were at Verve. And so Hodges brings them in to do back-to-back and side-by-side 2 records with Ellington at Verve that are outstanding and absolutely worth grabbing if you can find them. Louis Armstrong meets Oscar Peterson. This you can play at any dinner party, at any Saturday afternoon picnic. And the joy that comes from Oscar and Louis together. And Louis Armstrong, I can't not listen to him and have my hair stand on end and just be filled with an electricity. He's such a magnanimous, fiery personality that just wants to hug you. He just wants to reach out and touch you and welcome you into his world. He's not scaring you away. He's not obtrusive. He's inclusive. That's Armstrong. Buddy DeFranco, one of the great clarinetists. He's a fantastic player who moves into the modern era really, really interestingly in the 50s. And he's kind of a bridge between the classic, swing era clarinetists and guys like Jimmy Joffrey come along with that modernity and that composition and some of the edges of the avant-garde even that Jimmy Joffrey does. DeFranco's kind of a bridge between those things. Speaking of Jimmy Joffrey, he shows up here in the 8300s. And in the 8300s, Verve starts to kind of shift. They start to recognize there's this new sound, new kids. They start bringing in a few of those artists, mostly the whiter cats. And again, it's still a very different world, racially. Sonny Stitt, The Hard Swing, what a great album cover that is. The Boxing Glove, Meeting the Nose. It just has all kinds of motion and violence and sets the table for what's a fiery session. Ray Brown, he makes 4 or 5 records as a leader at Verve. One of the great probably the greatest bass player of all time. Ray Brown's tone is so pure. His rhythmic pulse is so effortless, but it's always placed so perfectly that it feels easy, but it's not. When you make perfect sound easy, that's a sign of genius. And it's easy until you try to do it yourself. To find that perfectly centered place on that fretless neck and be able to move around and just have that perfect placement of pattern and rhythm, Ray's a special guy. Jean-Michel Reeser Beethoven, again, has really taught me to love Ray Brown. And he truly is, sound-wise, one of the best recorded sounding bass players. Ron Carter's great, Paul Chambers is great, there's so many great bass players. But Ray Brown's really one of the pinnacles.
And you kind of come along to him later because he's so buried in the Oscar Peterson and the Verve canon. He doesn't take a lot of leadership roles, and so you don't really hear about him as fast as you should. Again, another Ben Webster titles, classic record, Soulville. You can't go wrong with that. This is getting us into like 58, 59. This is Stan Getz meets Chet Baker. Chet Baker's one lone showing at Verve Records is here with Stan Getz. Outstanding stuff. It's got some bluesiness, some real greens and purples and blues. Just wonderful, languid. It's a fantastic session. I was listening to it the other day. Another great Sonny Stitt record, Only the Blues. And again, he used a 12 or 13. I'm only showing you 2 or 3 of them. Absolutely grab that if you see it. Jerry Mulligan and Paul Desmond, 2 more young white kids from the West Coast, that new West Coast cool. Mulligan's a brilliant player, like Joffrey, very much in the composition, very much into arrangement. Mulligan's a huge force behind the birth of the cool, and really that session should be called Jerry Mulligan's Birth of the Cool, not Miles Davis. Mulligan composed and wrote a lot of the charts. Paul Desmond, of course, is famous from years of playing with Dave Brubeck, that light, airy alto playing that just puts pillows of clouds underneath your feet. You gotta love Paul Desmond. That's a great pairing. And the last thing I'm going to show is one more Sonny Stitt. I think this is his first at the label, 8219. And they put out a lot of stuff. They really do. It's an incredible body of work. But Verve is not to be slept on. You could make a case it's the most important, greatest jazz label of all time. And it's not really necessary to have to say what the greatest label of all time is. I'm just saying you can make a case for it. And for as great as Blue Note is for what they do, Verve is equally as great for what they do. And Verve is like the 4-lane highway. And it covers a lot of the material of the jazz canon. Blue Note is like the express lane. It's fast, it's up-tempo, it's aggressive, and if you're going to drive there, you better have your blinkers ready. You got to know something about tempo to be in that lane. See what I'm saying? Prestige will have stuff more from all 3 of these lanes. Impulse is on a frontage road out here, doing that Coltrane bit. That's a frontage road. You know what I mean? And even that way shorter, etc. That's a frontage road. That's not on the main highway. But you can still see the highway, and you have to know that highway's even there to know what you're shadowing. Again, the innovation of shorter is only as interesting as your comprehension of what the normal is. If you want that shorter record to sound incredible, preface it with an hour of Oscar Peterson. Preface it with an hour of simple melody, simple call and response, simple finding the root of the tonic and giving us that satisfaction of release melodically, coming back to the rut, and then go to that soundscape that is Wayne Shorter and hear how much more dynamic and compulsive and dangerous it sounds. We need all of it for the context of understanding. So that wraps up the first half of my series on Verve, what records to start with. It's a tough landscape to get to know, but it's all worthwhile, and you really can't go wrong. You know, so these records are greater, but so much of that early Verve canon, it's all to be known and to be digested. And you could take a lot of time to get to know that Verve canon, and I'm still learning it. Like, I know the Blue Note canon probably better than the Verve canon, and I filled out the 60s titles first because I could use a lot of that stuff, DJing, loungy kind of stuff, you know, kind of add that swingy, loungy, fun, accessible jazz in that Creed Taylor era. So I had all that stuff for DJing. But getting to know this early Verve stuff, it's almost like Norman Granz said, let's just record as much of it as we can, and we'll let time and posterity sort it out. And it just keeps all rising to the top. It's all such noteworthy, important music, documenting some of the most important jazz musicians to ever walk this planet. And if you want to understand and know jazz, understand these artists, these albums, these recordings. It'll allow you to know where the rest of the jazz canon fits. take the highway. Spend some time in the slow lane, spend some time in the fast lane, be passed by a few blue note guys on the way. There goes Lee Morgan. There goes Curtis Fuller. Oh, that's John Coltrane. Wave! We're staying here in that middle lane right now, because we still don't really know the way. But once we've taken this highway back and forth a few times, I think I'm comfortable to take the fast lane because I know where my exits are. And once I get bored with this highway, I might take that frontage road because there's some interesting shops over there on Wayne Shorter Boulevard. I want to stop over there. I want to poke my head into the great Ornette Coleman cul-de-sac and see what's happening in that little nook. That's how it needs to be. So it's a simple analogy, but it's definitely, I think, a valid one. Enjoy your Verve, find it, dig it, buy it, soak it in, comprehend it, and allow it to give you a mile marker so you know where you're at. Because jazz needs context to have meaning. My name is Dan, I'm the Jazz Shepherd. I appreciate you all. If you appreciate and value this channel, feel free to go to my Patreon and donate $5 a month just to help out the cause, to help me explore new music, to keep bringing great content and episodes. If you want to go to the merchandise page, there's some great Jazz Shepherd's hoodies, t-shirts, sweatpants, whatever. I'm going to be working on a new line of merchandise soon. But again, I appreciate you all my Patreon supporters. Thank you. You're all a blessing. I really enjoy having the opportunity to share, to kind of express my viewpoints on politics and social values and how music is a reflection of the times we live in. And nothing documents the 40s and the 50s and the 60s quite like jazz does. Because it doesn't have that dishonesty of words shaping through someone's lens the same way as someone's soul just pouring through their horn telling me what Ben Webster told me. But I'll be safe. Peace.